and welcome to today's Media Summit, covering an unprecedented election, presented by the National Task Force on Election Crises and Election SOS. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Rajiv Chandrasekaran, the head of policy and strategy at the Emmis Project in Seattle, and a former associate editor and senior correspondent at the Washington Post. I'm also proudly a member of the task force, and I'm very happy to be moderating today's conversations. Very happy to also see such a large number of news organizations attending today's webinar. It's a sign of how seriously you all take this unprecedented election, and I don't say that lightly. Also know how busy all of you are, and so we're doubly grateful for your participation today. As you all know, the media has a very critical role in this election, in particular to help the American public understand the challenges we face this cycle, as well as the laws and procedures that govern our electoral process. The Cross-partisan task force and its more than 50 experts from across the political spectrum and across political arenas, and the organizations supporting today's event are here to serve as an ongoing resource for you as you prepare for coverage of this election. Preserving a free and fair general election is our top priority, and we regard this as a patriotic duty, not a partisan one. I should note many of you may have also seen that the task force this morning sent letters, or actually last night sent letters to the AP, Fox, and the National Election Pool, urging major media outlets to detail how they plan to cover this most unusual election, particularly how news organizations will plan to account for the surge of mail-in ballots and projection of winners, something that we'll be discussing in detail on the panels today. Just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. Today's event is on the record and will begin with keynote remarks from Secretary Michael Chertoff, followed by 3 brief panel discussions covering the election process and the challenges we'll face along the way. There'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions following remarks from our keynote speaker and during each of our panels. We'll also have time at the end for questions from all of you with speakers from all of the panels together. You can submit your questions via the Zoom chat feature at any time during the program. Please kindly include your name, your affiliation, and which speaker to whom you would like the question directed. Finally, you can also follow and contribute to today's conversation on social media using the hashtag #ElectionSummit and follow us on Twitter @ElectionTask. And with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker of the morning, former Homeland Security Secretary Michael Chertoff. Secretary Chertoff, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rajiv, and I'm delighted to be here and to see such a significant turnout. Obviously, any presidential election is important, but this is more important than any I've lived through for 2 reasons. First of all, we have some real differences between the candidates that will affect the way our country moves forward over the next 4 years. But beyond that, and perhaps even more significant, trust in our democratic institutions is at stake, both within the US and in the place of some of our adversaries. There are people who are challenging our belief in democracy and our trust in our government institutions and our Constitution. And one of the principal ways in which they do that is by suggesting elections are rigged or stolen or not to be trusted. And if you look around the world, whether it's Belarus or Hong Kong or elsewhere, attacking the integrity of the election process is one of the main ways in which authoritarianism begins to get a foothold. So maintaining the integrity of our election process is, I think, a paramount obligation for all of us. In this respect, I want to say the media is not merely an observer or a recorder of what happens, but is actually a participant. Because what we've seen elsewhere in the world and what we see in the US is that some actors try to play off the media and use media reporting or partial reporting as a way of casting doubt on the entire enterprise. That's why not rushing to judgment, not trying to beat everybody else to the punch, and putting accuracy over speed will never be more important for the country than it is with respect to this election. all of us are first and foremost citizens and believers in democracy. And in carrying out our responsibilities, whether it be as government officials or as media participants, we need to keep that paramount interest at the top of mind. So I applaud the task force, of which I am also a member, for identifying 3 areas in which careful thought about how to do the reporting will make a big difference in terms of how people trust and rely upon our government process as we move forward. And that has to do with setting expectations before the vote, how we react on election day itself, and finally, how we treat the process after the election, when inevitably there will be challenges and questions raised about the results and about the accuracy. And maintaining good order, discipline, and faith in our process will be very, very critical. So with that, Rajiv, I'm happy to respond to questions.
Thank you, Secretary Chertoff. As a reminder, audience members can submit their questions for Secretary Chertoff through the chat. Please include your name and affiliation, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible in the next 12 minutes or so. As our audience readies their questions, let me kick off with 1 or 2. Secretary, given the level of disinformation that we're already seeing around this election, how do you think journalists can best cover all of this without inadvertently kind of signal boosting that the half-truths and lies that seem to be just building by day around this process?
Well, I think this is, of course, a question that's more general than just the election. We've been dealing with this for quite a period of time now. I would say that it's important to level set, by which I mean, if you are reporting a piece of disinformation from, let's say, a public official, I understand why there may be significance in reporting the fact that the official said it, but you need to explain the context going into the report. You need to say an unfounded statement emanated from XYZ today. Here's what the person said and here's why it's unfounded, as opposed to simply repeating it, which then allows it to take a life of its own.
Appreciate that. I'm wondering if you might just offer an assessment on the current levels of disinformation we're seeing with regard to domestic disinformation versus foreign disinformation. I realize you're not sitting in government today, but from the perch where you are, if you might just put into perspective, are we seeing a level of domestic disinformation that perhaps equals what we saw in terms of foreign interference in 2016? Are we now facing potentially an even greater domestic challenge than an overseas one?
Again, a good question. Just to say, I do monitor this because I'm chairman of the board of Freedom House. I'm co-chairing a Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity. I'm advising the German Marshall Fund, and all of these groups are monitoring what's going on with disinformation. So I would say that we're at a point now where probably more domestic generation of disinformation content is occurring than foreign. Frankly, I think in 2016, it wasn't that clear that the Russian efforts in terms of the actual persuasiveness of the content was all that sophisticated. I think what the Russians may well have learned is they don't have to make the content up. We have people in the US who will do it. All they have to do is amplify it and disseminate it more widely. And we've seen this again, not just with respect to the election, but with respect to things having to do with the COVID virus, with things having to do with what's going on in various demonstrations, with some of these absolutely bizarre conspiracy theories that wouldn't even be accepted as a science fiction plot, let alone be treated as real. And the challenge is that we're generating it quickly domestically, and then the Russians and other bad actors are using a megaphone to spread it around as much as possible.
We have a question from Manoa Changa Prism. It's a two-part question. The first is, what role, if any, should the media play in safeguarding democracy in this election and beyond. Curious for your thoughts there. And then a second question that really perhaps follows up on the first question I had asked you. What suggestions do you have for journalists covering the election so they don't waste time trying to essentially create a sense of false balance here under the guise of, of trying to give equal credence to both sides and thereby undermining the seriousness of particular issues, particularly when it comes to disinformation?
Great question. So I would say, first of all, I do think that the press does have a responsibility, both institutionally and because you have your citizens here, to make sure that we are protecting our democracy and our trusted institutions, not least because, frankly, it's those institutions which allow the press to flourish. That's, we have a First Amendment, and we protect that First Amendment because we have a democratic set of institutions. And in parts of the world, like Hong Kong and Belarus, where we've seen authoritarianism struggling with democracy, the press winds up being a victim when democracy loses. So I think that's true. In terms of the issue of balance, and I know this is a controversial issue among people who study the ethics of journalism, I think it's important to recognize a balance of opinions, and reporting both opinions is fair, but not both sets of facts. There is no alternative set of facts. As I think Nyhan said, you're entitled to your opinion, but not your facts. So I would think for journalists, in reporting factual matter, they ought to take a deep breath and not rush to get something out there. But it is fair if someone on one side or the other expresses a hostile or negative opinion, to report the fact that they did so, even as you underscore that that's their opinion and that it may be a minority opinion or even a hateful opinion.
Well, I'll just use this as a brief opportunity, Secretary, as I will a couple of times during the course of this morning, to put in a plug for the task force. As a former journalist, more than 2 decades in the profession, still feel like I have ink running through my veins. There is a challenge for journalists, but also a quest for so many to find in a hyper-partisan, supercharged environment, those objective sources who can help to identify what are that true set of facts. And the National Task Force is one great place to come for a range of nonpartisan and cross-partisan experts who can do just that. If I may throw a second question at you from the audience. This is from Annie Grayer. What are our blind spots in terms of how we track misinformation as a country?
Well, I think often, part of the problem is finding a context in which to evaluate the misinformation. Frankly, much of the misinformation I've observed is not totally fabricated out of whole cloth, although heaven knows you get some of that too. But more often it's something that is spun in a way that doesn't have context, or that's exaggerated, or that in some way or another is distorted. And so you have to make a judgment. Is this really not factual, or is it just something that may be argued in a particular way, but the core of it is in fact true? That's a difficult judgment to make. And again, because we believe in the First Amendment, we don't want to err on the side of shutting things down. We prefer to air them and let the marketplace of ideas respond. But I would say this, we don't want to be naive. If something is truly fabricated or really distorted and we don't call it out, then it's like a marketplace in which some of the goods being sold are shoddy goods or poorly manufactured goods. It doesn't work the way it's supposed to. So I think looking at context, looking at alternative sources of perspective on the same issue, and maybe even consulting with experts can be a useful way in evaluating the approach to take.
Just to follow up on that, my wife and I sometimes get into a little bit of an argument at home. We have 2 school-age boys, and when they sort of misbehave a little bit, my wife tries to admonish me, just ignore it. as opposed to engaging with them and turning it into something bigger. When it comes to misinformation, should we adopt a little bit more of, my wife's approach to this by saying, look, if the less attention for some of the stuff we pay to it, just let it sort of fizzle out? To what degree do you believe that journalists have an obligation in the pursuit of truth and objectivity to actively confront some of this stuff and say, hey, look, this is wrong, try to disprove it, recognizing that in so doing, you could put a little bit more fuel on that fire?
Yes, and there's also always been a view that when there's somebody that attacks you, you don't repeat the accusation because you then amplify it. Yep. And I would say, again, it depends on context. I would not respond or chase down every outlandish conspiracy theory or story that's out there, because you're quite right. In many cases, the propagators of that are actually counting on the media to elevate it. On the other hand, when the source of the misinformation is, shall we say, a prominent public official, or where it appears to be getting traction in a significant part of the community, as we see, for example, with extremist groups on the right and the left, then I think it's fair to identify the fact that there is misinformation or conspiracy theorizing out there and that it's incorrect. So it's a judgment about whether something has reached a level of traction that warrants inoculating people about it versus something that may just be ephemeral and we wouldn't respond to any more than we'd respond to the ravings of a lunatic walking down the street.
Secretary, I'd like to switch the conversation a little bit from misinformation and disinformation to election violence, and to ask you a couple of questions in this regard. The first, just drawing upon your government service and experience. During some of the civil rights protests of the summer, we saw Homeland Security personnel, law enforcement personnel who work for DHS being ordered into the streets of some American cities to ostensibly protect federal property, but also in a position where they were engaging with some of the demonstrators. Just following from that, both at a high level, how concerned are you about the prospect of violence surrounding this election, and the role that individuals from your former department may be called upon or ordered to play with regard to quote unquote election security, both in the run up to the election and potentially in the aftermath?
So I don't see a role for the Department of Homeland Security in dealing with challenges or violence on election day. I don't think that's part of the responsibility. It is true that there is authority to protect federal installations, but I don't believe that would apply, obviously, to polling places which are run by state and counties. I suppose you could have them protecting the post office if someone was afraid of an attack on the post office, but that seems a little far-fetched. I think likewise, to his credit, General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, has said he does not envision the military playing a role in the election. And in fact, there are laws, statutes that restrict what the federal government can do at polling places on election day. I do worry a little bit about violence from extremists on both sides. And I hope that the states and cities have got plans to deal with this issue with their own law enforcement authorities, security authorities, but doing it in such a way that does not intimidate voters. So this is a balance that has to be walked between making people secure when they vote, but also not becoming a force for intimidation. But in my view, this is a state and local issue. It is not an issue for DHS or for the US military.
Secretary Chertoff, thank you very much for your time and insights this morning. I truly appreciate it. It wouldn't be a Zoom webinar in our modern world if there wasn't some sort of crazy thing happening. And I have a massively loud car alarm going off on the street right in front of me, so I apologize for the background noise. I will try to mute as soon as I introduce the next panel. And so I'd like to invite members of the first panel on setting expectations to please join me now as we transition to this panel. This discussion will cover the important set of subjects in the period between now and Election Day, including voting by mail, misinformation and disinformation, election interference, and voter suppression. Really happy to have as three leading experts on these subjects. The first is Vanita Gupta, President and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, and the former head of the Civil Division in the U.S. Justice Department. Brendan Nyhan, Professor of Government at Dartmouth College, and Tammy Patrick, Senior Advisor of Elections at the Democracy Fund. Confusion and disinformation are already thick, and the integrity of our democracy is at stake. Helping voters make sense of everything without inadvertently boosting misinformation has never been more important. Vanita, I'd like to start out with you, if I could. The partisan atmosphere here is just so incredibly charged, and there's so much growing distrust over the overall process. In this fraught environment, how can we help set the right expectations for the 3rd of November, particularly as many voters simply just aren't sure who to trust?
Yeah, thank you for Rajiv for hosting this conversation. It's really important. I think there is right now incredibly intense challenges to the election. There's no question. We've been COVID obviously being the most glaring, but also concerns around the attacks on the U.S. Postal Service, attacks on mail-in voting, statements being made about mail-in voting that simply have no bearing and evidence by officials who the public should be able to trust, active misinformation online. But the bottom line is that we have to ensure in the lead up now, where many states are already sending out absentee ballots where voters are going to be able to vote or are voting already. This is an election season, not election day. I want to say that as one thing for all of us to understand. But it's really important that voters actually have confidence because in some ways, all of these concerns and challenges that we're facing will, if it serves to undermine voters' confidence, it actually serves to encourage voters to sit it out or to not participate. And one of the things that's really important amidst all of the mis and disinformation is for voters to understand that they actually have power, that they are change agents, that they can, if they make a plan to vote early, to go to vote.org, make sure you're registered, make sure you've got your absentee ballot early if that's how you're going to vote, if you're going to go in person, that you are have the information you need. This voter empowerment message is really crucial, and it is really important also that the media be kind of amplifying these messages even while covering some of these attacks on our democratic institutions and on the efforts, some of which, the Leadership Conference and other organizations are involved in, to protect our democratic infrastructure. Because the concern is that if the media is only in the kind of business of raising the alarm about what's going on, it can create so much noise and confusion in and of itself for voters that it can create its own form of voter suppression. Voter suppression isn't just the impediments that get stood in the way for voters when they try to vote. It's also the active discouragement or dissuasion or confusion or fear mongering that can beset voters and have them sit it out. So I think, again, going back to what Secretary Chertoff mentioned, the media has a role to play, not allowing for premature calling of results on election night, making sure that they are tracking credible messengers. Often state and local election officials are going to be putting out accurate information, nonpartisan institutions, civil rights organizations. These are the types of institutions that should be sources. The task force should be a source of information about what's happening in real time to prevent misinformation from being amplified.
Vanita, can I follow up on that real quickly? We're in this position right now where organizations like yours and experts like you are trying to highlight what's kind of working in the system and pushing back against many of these very specious claims of possible fraud and dysfunction. At the same time, there are still in this country some very real concerns about disenfranchisement because of possible shortage of poll workers, an underinvestment chronically in elections technology at the state and local level, because of laws at the state level, in some cases that have been designed to make it more difficult for Americans of color, poorer Americans, older Americans to vote. And these are challenges that groups like yours and others have been focused on for some years. In this environment, what advice do you have for journalists to not neglect that, to focus on that while not playing into the hand of those trying to make specious claims about the overall election not being reliable?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the current attacks on legitimate forms of voting, like mail-in voting, absentee voting, whatever you want to call it, are actually designed to put into question the legitimacy of the election and designed to give voters less confidence that they should vote, that their vote will be counted. And so I think the media has this balance role. In fact, advocates have this balance role. It's a kind of tension that has always existed, but that is heightened in this very polarized and toxic environment right now, which is we have to continue to highlight and advocate for those of us that are advocates to protect the U.S. Postal Service, to put out the right information about mail-in voting and the states it's been used in for years and years, and to defeat the kind of narratives that can actively, as I say, stoke voter suppression. We are going to continue to do that work. The media should continue to cover this. These are important issues, and call it out though when officials say drop boxes aren't sanitary or safe. We've got to call the lies. When officials may say, we're going to put law enforcement at the polls, it's important for all of us to be able to say, actually, there's federal law that prohibits armed law enforcement from being at the polls. But that's the balance also with the importance of giving voters the reassurance that the election is legitimate, that voters have power, that if they make a plan and there are all these ways to be educated about what the rules are and to understand which sources of information to use. I think we've got to be able to kind of do both of these things as both media and as advocates, to call these things out. But also to be really clear about why voters and how voters can actually show up for our democracy. Because I think, there's a real danger in having these attacks on our democratic institutions, on the lies and misinformation, very intentional, long been a part of our history, not new, although much more perhaps nefarious because social media can have these things carry much faster. But this has been a part of our history. But if we are only focusing on all of the challenges at this moment in a time where voters need to have confidence, that can be corrosive in and of itself. So I think it's about doing both of these things at once.
Thanks, Vanita. Just as a quick reminder to our audience, you can fire away with questions for the panel just in the Zoom chat. Brendan, let me move over to you now. You've spent a lot of time studying and focusing in on the subject of misinformation and disinformation. Secretary Chertoff talked about that in his opening remarks. I'd like to delve in a little deeper with you, if I could. And the first is maybe just to ask you for a little practical advice for the journalists who are listening today. No reporter wants to be sucked in to covering something that is false. They don't want to be tricked. They don't want to be, they don't want to fall for it. In an environment where so much is coming so quickly, where we have, the deep fakes of the world, where we have so many doctored videos, obviously, we've talked a little bit about the broader threat here, but what advice do you have in this supercharged environment for journalists not to themselves fall prey to misinformation and disinformation?
Good question. I want to acknowledge that there are a lot of different kinds of mis and disinformation, like you talked about, whether it's bots and trolls, deep fakes, foreign interference, et cetera. But the primary source of misinformation in people's information diets is from mainstream political figures via the mainstream media. We like to externalize this problem to social media platforms and online actors, but most people are getting most of their news from the mainstream media still. And that means that newsrooms need to prepare for a political environment in which mainstream political figures, most notably the president of the United States, are going to promote false and unsupported claims about the election. They need to prepare for that now. And they need to have a conversation internally about how to cover those claims in a way that's consistent with their journalistic values and the small d democratic values that Secretary Chertoff emphasized. That's critical to prepare for now. And it's not just about preparing for that moment before Election Day, it's for preparing for that evening and the time afterwards if the count continues. So I want to highlight 3 important points that journalists need to be prepared for right from the beginning. And I want to underscore the stakes here. This is not a normal election. That's why we're here. But let me just underscore that point for one moment. I'm one of the organizers of a group called Brightline Watch that does regular expert surveys with political scientists in the United States. They perceive significant erosion in the quality of US democracy. And that's a judgment that's mirrored by other international ratings. So we've already seen decline in the quality of US democracy. The legitimacy of our elections being challenged, however, would be an even more fundamental step towards democratic erosion. That's why preparing for this now is so critical and why media organizations can play such an important role. So 3 points I'd like to emphasize. The first is that media organizations need to set appropriate expectations about when the result of the election will be decided. As many have discussed over the last few months, we may not know the winner on election night. The media needs to prepare the public for that, and they need to avoid amplifying premature claims of victory, particularly given which ballots are counted first. In our country, your vote counts the same, whether your vote is counted first or counted last. If the media are not careful, however, they could give presumptive legitimacy to whoever is ahead at that first moment, and that would be a profound mistake. This could be Dewey versus Truman on steroids, incredibly dangerous in a context where there might be a dispute over who the legitimate winner of the election was. So the media need to be prepared for that moment. They need to build their coverage around a scenario in which the winner of the election is not known on election night, and be prepared for a style of coverage that says it is too early to know. A careful count will require more time. The second point is, I think, going back to your question, Rajiv, is to avoid amplifying misinformation. And all the standard caveats apply about being careful about your sources and not amplifying things that you haven't verified. But I want to push the media a little bit harder. I think that sounds easy. It's not easy. And the reason is those claims will often be made by high-profile political figures, again, most notably the President of the United States, in a way that media organizations feel like they have to cover on deadline. And if they are not careful, they will cover them in a he said, she said manner that gives legitimacy to unfounded and unverified or unrepresentative claims, isolated incidents. We have a complicated decentralized electoral system. There will always be snafus. The media can very much distort perceptions of this election if they highlight isolated incidents and portray them as the norm or commonplace. The final suggestion that I want to encourage members of the media to think about is how they will fill the void if we do have a count that takes longer than anticipated. If we have a result that isn't decided on election night, there will be a kind of void in the news environment at that time where counting will be happening behind the scenes and there won't be the drama of election night. That style of coverage, John King standing in front of the map, can only get you so far. And news organizations need to have a plan for how they will responsibly provide coverage in that moment, which is when I think we might be most vulnerable to misinformation. Because if the count is going on in that way, there will be demand to know the answer. There will be suspicions that things are happening behind the scenes, that malfeasance is taking place. It's going to be essential for the media to be responsible in that moment. They really are guardians of the legitimacy of our democratic process. And it will be tempting in that moment to just put people on TV saying things about what's happening, right? Including that the election is being stolen. And I would just encourage everyone to think about the stakes here again, that we live in a country that is at significant risk of democratic erosion. And amplifying those kinds of claims in that moment is a profoundly irresponsible act.
Brendan, thank you so much. Not to make light of anything, but it feels like we sort of need a few bonus episodes of Game of Thrones to drop the day after the election, just to sort of distract everybody for a little bit. Hey, we're also really lucky to have Tammy Patrick on this panel, who is probably the foremost expert out there on what is happening with regard to the Postal Service and our election system and the broader subject of vote by mail. And so Tammy, I'd like to turn it over to you for a brief moment here, and just to kind of give us your lay of the land. We've obviously, all of us read, many on this webinar have written or broadcast reports about problems at the US Postal Service. Given this unprecedented surge, and I'm sorry, I've used the word unprecedented like 5 or 6 times this morning already. I realize that, you know, that's a little verboten in our world, but we truly are in this unprecedented moment. And that's why we're all here and talking about this stuff. So I may use it another dozen times. But anyway, given this, this crazy, unusual election season and the surge in voting by mail, love your assessment on how you feel the Postal Service is going to be able to handle that. And more broadly, as journalists are trying to figure this out, trying to understand just how much voting by mail may be occurring in certain states, as well as how the infrastructure will work. Tammy, kind of bring us up to speed and help us better understand what are the areas in which you believe merit more media attention at this point.
Great, well, thank you. And I think you're right. I think our use of unprecedented is unprecedented for good reason. You know, there's so many rich stories here that can get information out to combat the mis and disinformation around things like the security of voting by mail, and as well as the reporting on election night and afterwards. So I think that it's going to be important that we think about the fact that in this moment, we are focused, of course, on the election, but we are still in a global pandemic in which voters are going to need to make choices. As Vanita mentioned, having a plan to vote is going to be critical. And November 3rd should be the backup plan for everyone. So the first thing voters need to do is decide if they want to vote by mail or vote in person. And if they want to vote by mail, really the critical element in all of this is that it is absolutely the case that we have a new Postmaster General. And I think that they hit the ground running a little too fast when they took the job and made some changes that were highly questionable. There was a lack of transparency. The tone kind of shifted from what we've been working on for the last decade with the Postal Service on what I've often called delivering democracy, because we know that for tens of millions of Americans, they have their ballot handed to them by their postal carrier, not by a poll worker. And it's going to be even more so in this moment. We have more states that are going to be sending out ballots automatically, 10 states automatically sending out ballots to registered voters, not to households. We have more states that are mailing out applications to voters. And I say that in a weighted way because far too often we're seeing social media and other platforms conflating those two things, applications versus ballots, individuals getting multiple applications because everyone, both political parties as well as, you know, many nonprofit organizations and organizations are sending out applications to voters. And so voters taking pictures of the 6 or 7 different applications they've gotten, thinking that that means they get 5 or 6 different ballots. And of course, that's not the case. So there's stories here around what we need our voters to know, and that is that you get to vote once. But even that narrative is a little bit difficult because, you know, the president has said, request an absentee ballot, vote it, and then go and try and vote in person and see if you can test the security of how secure this really is. Well, the reality of it is that in most of the states, that will result in a provisional ballot that will further slow down voting in person. But in a handful of states, they're going to wait to count their absentee ballots, and that voter is going to get a standard ballot. So in their mind, they may believe that now they have in fact voted twice. So it's going to be important that we keep an eye on the delivery standards. There are a couple of news outlets out there that are watching the Postal Service's delivery standards. I will tell you right now that I have not seen a delay in election mail. Which we were very concerned about that after some of the messaging we heard over the summer around the use of the official mail logo. That's another thing to make sure readers, viewers, and audiences understand, is that only election officials can use the official election mail logo, and that's kind of the flag logo that you see on your ballots and other items. And that's a good way to distinguish between someone who's trying to appear as though they are official from those who truly are official. And so we want to make sure we're keeping an eye on the delivery standards. My main concern has been, we know that the Postal Service recommends voters mail back their ballot if they choose to mail it back or have to mail it back because they don't have drop-off locations available, that they mail it back at least 1 week in advance. Now, there are 20-some states that allow a voter to still request a ballot after that time period, and it sets a false expectation that if they wait until the deadline, they'll be fine, when in reality, they could be in jeopardy of even receiving the ballot before Election Day. So I often say, just because you can request at the deadline doesn't mean you should. So I would say focus now on the first day that ballots mail out. They've already mailed out in North Carolina coming up this week. Every state will be mailing out military and overseas voters ballots, as well as about a dozen or so other states. So focusing on ballots mailing out now, and then the voter gets the ballot and has it for a couple of weeks to be able to get it back in person, mail it back without any issue or concern around whether it takes an extra day or so with the Postal Service.
Thanks, Tammy. You're truly a font of information on this subject. There's a question in the chat from Clark Merrifield on the counting of mail-in votes. I'm going to hold that till the third panel, Clark, and pitch that over to Jennifer Morell, who's an expert on this subject. So stay tuned on that. There's also been a nice discussion in the chat among Vanita and Kurt Samsel about disinformation. I'd like to just sort of throw this to the panel, and maybe Vanita, you can give a very, very brief take on what you were just saying in the chat. But Kurt Samsel asked if there are better journalism tactics than appending the quote unquote without evidence disclaimer to bad faith election claims. What do you guys think is the most effective way to frame disinformation? We've just got a couple of minutes left, so let's make it quick.
Just quickly, in addition to saying without evidence, I think it's important to provide counter evidence, and there's a lot of it to disclaim some of these lies. And so the more that you can actually provide in real life examples of how states have been engaging certain forms of voting and the like, the more confidence voters will have that, for example, vote by mail is entirely safe and secure and has been used for years and years in states without any glitch or scandal. So that counter evidence and those affirmative examples, I think, is really important to provide. And there's expertise that can help shape and give you those facts as needed.
Rajiv, if I could just add to that, also, one of the things that I often say is that you need to know what's right in order to know what's wrong. And so I think that journalists need to really get a hold of their local election officials, talk to state election officials, understand what equipment is being used in a state, if you're a state-based organization, so that when you see these videos being displayed, you know that that's not correct, because that's not the kind of equipment being used in that state that it's being purported to be used in. There's a wealth of resources out there to make sure that everything's kind of brought together in a single place. So I would refer journalists to places like the Vote at Home Institute. Belfer's Defending Digital Democracy has a new national database that they're putting out on some of the laws around voting by mail and the changes that we've seen. And then also the healthyelections.org website has all of the litigation that's out there, because that's another element, is things are going to change in many states. So knowing that in this moment where we can get trusted source of information is going to be really critical.
Real quickly, we've got about a minute left. I just wanted to throw out a question from Rowan Phillip with regard to the intimidation of poll workers. There are going to be a lot of poll watchers. There are a lot of poll watchers, counter watchers. Despite the need to be socially distant, I think there are going to be a lot of people in a lot of polling spots looking in. He's asking, do you have any tips on ways to track the groups and money behind those who might be seeking to intimidate poll watchers?
One thing that I would mention is there are a couple of resources like the William and Mary Law School, the eBenchbook website that have all of the election codes in one place. So the first thing you would want to do is find out who is even sanctioned to be in the polling place as an observer. In many places, they have to be tied to and assigned by the political party, but in other places, anyone has access to go in and observing. So that would be the first thing I would do, is to say, find out what the rules of engagement are in a state. And I'm not sure if anyone else has any comments on specific organizations.
I will just say Fair Fight is an organization that has been tracking some of these voter intimidation tactics and tools and funding. So they're a resource to go to. They do periodic briefings on this with the goal of staving off voter intimidation in this coming election.
Vanita, Brendan, Tammy, thank you all three for your comments this morning. And more importantly, thank you all for the work you're doing to help ensure that we have a safe and secure and fair election. So really appreciate it. Now let's move on to our second all-star panel of the morning, focused on preparing for Election Day. And we're going to talk here in the next 25 minutes about how we can take key lessons from the 2000 election, on projection and modeling changes with the rise of absentee ballots in this cycle, and how election night may actually not be election night, but actually election week or weeks. We're joined by four great experts. The first is a one-time dean of the DC Press Corps, former DC Bureau Chief of the Associated Press, Ron Fournier. Trey Grayson, former Secretary of State of Kentucky and former president of the National Association of Secretaries of State. María Teresa Kumar, president and CEO of the Voto Latino Foundation. And Norm Ornstein, resident scholar at AEI, whose writings many of you read on a regular basis. Thank you all four for being here today. If we don't start preparing for Election Day, or rather Election Week or weeks now, will likely be too late. And so in the spirit of journalists not just focusing on the immediate story right in front of them, but planning a little bit ahead here, I'd like to really focus on the challenges facing our democracy on Election Day, which are going to be significant, but may well be manageable if we dig in now. Ron, let me start with you. Many of us remember 2000 clearly. Some of us may still have a little PTSD from that period of time. But now with the remove of some years, it's hard to believe it's 2 decades. What stands out in some ways with this passage of time is really the confusion, the chaos, the legal uncertainty that followed election night. Given your role at the AP back then and all you've done since, what lessons, Ron, can we draw from that 2000 election for this year's general?
Well, it's interesting because I think 2020 has the possibility of being, unless Vice President Biden wins in a landslide, it has the possibility of being 2020 could make 2000 look like a high school election for president. There are some analogies, but this election is 2000 on steroids. Let's go back and look at first number one. A lot of us got it wrong that night. Every news organization about 8 o'clock at night, about 10 minutes to 8, called Florida for Gore. A lot of people forget. And then at 2:15 in the morning, everybody except the Associated Press called Florida for Bush. And then, if you recall, a little bit later, the APs stuck to their guns and the election swung back to the middle and Gore retracted his concession and we were off and running. So one, a lot of us got it wrong and got it wrong twice, a lot of the news organizations. Two, there was a lot of confusion about what we were doing in the media. There wasn't a lot of transparency then about how we called the elections, even as it was unfolding and we were getting egg on our face. I do know at the AP, again, to the credit of my old news organization, which is the gold standard for this, we spent as much time writing advisories to our members, explaining why we weren't calling the election for Bush, as we did writing the actual stories, to try to give at least our members, and now then we were the intranet. We were writing to other news organizations, explaining what we were doing, but we weren't being very transparent, we being the AP and the public, with the media. 3, we were under enormous pressure. 1, competitively to get it first, which always happens in journalism, but 2, from both parties. I was fielding calls from Karl Rove in Bush's campaign and Michael Hooley in Gore's campaign, and another 12 from both sides, pressuring me to pressure my colleagues to call the race for their side, or to at least listen to their spin. So you had 2 kinds of pressure back then that went into our decision-making and distorted the decision-making. 3 or 4 actually was we realized that covering the campaign didn't end election night. Up until that year, covering a campaign was like running a marathon, and when you got to the end of it, you were done. This year, we got to the end of it, and the guy said, you got to keep running, and you got to run faster than you've been. So what have we learned? 1, get it first, get it right, then get it first. 2, we need to be more transparent from the beginning, because the old days, what's changed in 20 years is now we are able to and have the responsibility to communicate directly with voters and don't have to go through other news organizations like the AP was doing. And we need to start letting them know now that we're not going to have an election night, we're going to have an election season, as was said earlier. And once we hit election day, we got to say it again. And then as we go through what will probably be a very extended election season, we need to be transparent about what decisions we made, why we haven't made them, and what it will take to be able to make a decision and call the presidency. And the last thing is that pressure. As much pressure as I felt in 2000 from both parties, and to be competitive against my competitors in the media, it's going to be exponentially more pressure now, because you're not just going to be fielding calls as a reporter or a decision desk person or as a bureau chief. You're not just going to be getting calls from the campaigns. You're going to be facing ungodly pressure on social media from the mobs on the left and the mobs on the right. We didn't have that in 2000. We only had to focus on our competitors and the campaigns. Now it's going to be that kind of pressure, that kind of a pressure cooker, and that possibility for error is going to be on steroids.
Thanks, Ron. Really appreciate it. As you were talking about that pressure and recalling the calls you got from Karl Rove, the people sitting in your chair this cycle, it's going to be tweets directed at them from potentially a candidate and not just their advisors. I'll come back to you in a second. I just want to move now to Trey and talk about the role of state election officials. Trey, are state election officials ready for election night? All eyes in some cases, in some states, are gonna be on them. And when it comes to journalists looking for those trusted sources on election night, how prepared do you believe state, local election officials are going to be able to speak and engage with the press and provide information in a timely and accurate way?
So yeah, thanks for that question. I think that, yeah, state election officials are ready. Even if we were in a normal presidential election, when you're in the election world and election administration world, your jobs peak on election day. And I do want to make a distinction between the state election administrators and the local election administrators, especially in regard to answering your question. Got to keep in mind on election day itself, the local election administrators, whoever, in Kentucky, we call them a county clerk, they are much more focused on the literal operation, administration of the election. State officials, in most states, that's the Secretary of State, and some it's an appointed state election director. They're more likely to be able to engage personally with the media on election day. Both offices and both groups, they'll have their own people, that director of communications, press secretaries, people like that. But don't expect to get a lot of access directly to a local election administrator, a county clerk, a executive director of a board of elections, something like that. The state level, the Secretary of State's probably accessible. I spent most of my days on the phone doing radio interviews, television interviews. The media I found to be a great partner on election day, because they would ask for a little bit of news. Hey, what are you hearing? We would tell them what we were hearing. And then they would let us send out the reminders about when the polls close and what numbers to call for all of that. My suggestion for folks covering the election is, to the extent that you need access to those local administrators, do that in advance. Start those conversations now. But because I think if you want to cover this race, you need to understand the rules in your state or jurisdiction, because they may vary, because it's different. Some states have changed their rules dramatically. Kentucky, Ohio, and others modified their rules, some by legislative edict, some by regulation, some by court order. In other states like Florida, we're going to see a proportion shift. Instead of maybe a third voting in election day, in advance of election day in person and by mail, we may see that shift. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for media to lay the groundwork. My anticipation is that folks like my former colleagues will be doing outreach, but please, if they don't, reach out so you can get that information. And they should be your partner in helping to cover this election. They have a vested interest in you getting the story right. And so they should be able to provide that information. So, and the other thing to probably keep in mind is it's probably good also to identify who are some others in the state that can provide some context. Maybe it's a former election administrator, somebody who's more of a straight shooter, not somebody who's going to speak on behalf of a party or a campaign. So, somebody like me who's a former Secretary of State could weigh in my state or in my part of the country. But look for those folks. Several are involved in the task force. We can help you find those trusted sources. Like if you have any question about mail, Tammy Patrick is like one of the best people in the country to talk to from a technical standpoint, as well as some others. So those trusted experts are out there and available as well to provide that context to help you cover the race when maybe the official isn't available or might be compromised because maybe it's something going on. And so you want to get that context where somebody could say, oh yeah, that is something to worry about. Maybe they messed up or you're not getting the full story. Ask this question.
Thank you, Trey. And, embedded in your answer was just a great journalism 101 lesson. Take the time now to build a relationship with those sources you need. Don't, be in a position of having to cold call somebody at a moment of great need on election night. Let me move over to Maria Teresa now and talk a little bit about another key group. We've talked a lot about official sources. But let's talk about voters, and voters are also news consumers. I mean, this is the audience for whom our participants today, our attendees, are writing for, are broadcasting for. Maria, Teresa, particularly given how COVID has upended the process, what do you believe voters are most hungry for in both the lead up to the election and as we head on to election night? What do you believe they're not getting enough of in the media, and what do they want and need?
Yeah, no, Rajiv, thank you for having this conversation, and thank you for pointing out. And I think, first of all, I think we have to level set and recognize that the role of consumers of media has also changed. They are also distributors of information. And if we can recognize the role of people who are hyper consumers, giving them information because they become your distribution channels. They are the modern day fax machine. They are the modern day paper route, so to speak. And that is where we find the challenge in making sure that communities that may be new to the system don't always get or targeted with the accurate information. And so as a general voter, what people are looking for right now under COVID is transparency. They're getting all these mixed messages that it's going to be really difficult to vote, that there's going to be an onslaught of voting, that there's going to be long lines. There is that the Postal Service may or may not be on their side. So I will share with you as a best practice not to do what we did in 2014, right after the gutting of the Voting Rights Act. Right after the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, all of us collectively shared the same message that voting became inexorably harder for communities of color. That artificially ended up depressing the vote. Our job right now is providing people with calming information, how to access their vote, how to share their vote, share access to information. So if you have early voting, making it as clear and as unsensational as possible, making it as unbiased as possible, and making it as matter of fact as possible. That is the best thing we can do for maximizing participation right now in our electoral base. When it comes to communicating with communities of color, there is this misunderstanding that immigrant communities, that Latino communities don't consume media. That is not the case. The challenge in the Latino community and immigrant communities is that we are
hyper consumers of media, but we have yet to understand the digital literacy so that we can understand what is vetted media and what is not vetted media. The news that's coming out of Florida, for example, where there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation targeting the Latino community, we have been monitoring that now for 19 months. And it's because the Latino community, the majority of us actually speak English, and most of our information is balkanized. So what I encourage the APs and the Wall Street Journals and the New York Times and the Miami Heralds is to provide a very synthesized, unbiased, transparent information, and encouraging people to share that information. At Voto Latino, I will share with you, we share graphics that basically just have days that you can go ahead and start early voting. Those, believe it or not, are some of our best posts, much more widely shared than even a Rosario Dawson or Selena Gomez, because people are hungering for just real information from vetted sources. And I would encourage other folks to recognize that using a lot of the traditional ethnic media as an ally, reaching out to, Houston, for example, has roughly a marketplace of 200 different languages. Mostly they are Pan-Asian languages, partnering with them so that they can get the right information out to these audiences, because I think we could all agree that our democracy works best when people have accurate information, when the temperature's toned down, and when there's maximum information. So we at Voto Latino, we're encouraging people to vote early and to make sure that their vote is secure. So we're asking people to, to follow up with their election officials to make sure that their ballot actually made it. But it's this very practical process that oftentimes gets lost in the media, because we recognize that the tensions are different. We recognize that this is such a critical election, and we recognize that there are different actors playing in this election than others. But the best service that we can do to the American public is to simplify it and make it as easy and transparent and as unbiased as possible.
Maria Teresa, thank you so much. Let me turn over to Norm now. Norm, what happens if President Trump declares victory on election night, when most of the in-person ballots have been tabulated, but potentially millions upon millions of mailed-in ballots have yet to be counted, particularly in some key battleground states? What guidance do you have for journalists in terms of how to respond to a claim of victory like that?
So Rajiv, among our many nightmares of this election, I think this is the #1 nightmare possibility. And we know it's been signaled by President Trump, by Attorney General Barr, by a lot of others, Republican office holders and those in the media, laying the groundwork for a potential declaration of this sort. My advice to media starts before the election. There are really 3 periods here. And that includes hammering away in the weeks leading up to the election, not just once, but multiple times, that we should not expect results on election eve. That's not in the Constitution anyhow. Generally, official results don't come for many weeks thereafter. We need to make people understand that this is going to be a different election, because many of the results are not going to come in until days or possibly even weeks thereafter. And the second element of that is the preparation that news organizations have to do leading up to this election. One of the things that I would recommend is that you make sure you know, in the battleground states in particular, what rules exist for the counting of, the processing and counting of votes by mail. California has traditionally had a huge problem in this area, as we know, including in the midterm contest the last time, where we didn't get results in a number of congressional races for weeks after the election, because they didn't start processing those votes by mail, which were half or more of the votes in California, until the election itself. California's now changed, and we're likely to get results earlier. But in states like Michigan and Pennsylvania right now, where secretaries of state are trying to get the processing of ballots earlier, they may not get that change. And there are going to be states where we're going to know the results within 2 or 3 or 4 days. others where it may take longer, and you want to be prepared with that. We also, I think, should see news organizations compile data in advance. What I would suggest, among other things, is look at the number of votes cast by precinct and states in the ones that matter in 2016, the last presidential election. So you know how many votes were cast. When you see the ballots coming in on election eve, as we move towards election eve, you're going to have a template to have a pretty good idea of how many votes are not yet processed on election eve. And you need to make that clear. If, for example, and we know from surveys that we're likely to see in many states more votes cast on election day by Republicans who have indicated in Wisconsin and even nationally that they have a greater intention to vote in person, including the early voting days. And Democrats at this point and independents are more likely concerned about COVID to vote by mail. If you know that only 1/3 of the ballots have been counted on election eve, you need to make it very clear that many, many more votes have yet to be cast. And remember, we have many states where history says that 5 or 6% have voted by mail. That may be 50 or 60% this time. Finally, let me say that, I should also add, be very careful about exit polls this time. Our task force has issued a letter to news organizations. It's been a challenge for those of us who have been working with networks, as I did over many decades with CBS, with BBC. We relied heavily on exit polls. They're getting harder and harder to evaluate. And now it will be doubly, triply, or quadruply more difficult because of those votes cast by mail. Don't make projections as easily and as regularly as you've done in the past. What Ron did with AP in 2000 is a great template for being careful about issuing those results. In the aftermath of the election, let me say, and I'm hoping that we're going to be able to get a commission. I, of course, have called for one with Bush and Gore. I see that Dan Coates, the former director of national intelligence, is calling for another kind that can make it clear to voters when results are not to be taken seriously or declarations of victory. But keep in mind as well, if we can get past that particular bump in the road on election eve, and let's hope we have enough of a landslide that we don't need to worry about this, we're going to have lots of contested ballots, more than we have usually seen this last time. We're going to have them over votes by mail. We know that many are rejected because of signature mismatches, and for other reasons. We're going to have many provisional ballots. Have as open a process, be prepared in states where this will take place, so that the legitimacy of the process, when contested ballots are brought forward, that you understand, that you can look at why ballots are not being counted or whether they should be counted, so that the final results, there is a sense of legitimacy in the country as a whole. This is a burden for news organizations greater than we have seen before, and you have to be able to respond to that burden in those 3 periods, leading up to the election, election eve itself, the next day, and the days that follow.
Thanks, Norm. We've got just 2 minutes. I want to try to tackle 2 questions real quickly. The first is from Hari Srinivasan, asking, and maybe I'll just start real briefly with you on this, Ron, editorial guidance on how to frame a headline without feeding a completely false narrative. He raises the example, Trump tweets elections being stolen, and stolen implies that it was already his. What guidance, as a former wire guy, would you have for us?
Right now, there is none. And what my guidance would be, what I wish would happen is this consortium that we now have, in which the news organizations share the process to produce the data, and then the news organizations actually share the data, and then compete who analyzes it first. If I could wave a magic wand, they would use that consortium that I was a part of in 2008 as the bureau chief to come up with these guidelines, to come up with these guideposts by which you call races, by which you explain to the public why a race hasn't been called, and by which you explain the election. If all the networks and the news organizations and the newspapers and the wire service that are part of this consortium agreed on how they were going to conduct themselves, I don't want to take away the competition, They're going to want to be first. But if they agreed on how they were going to compete and how they were going to explain their competition to the public, I think that would go a long way to solving all the problems that everybody's mentioned. Not be in cahoots, compete, but agree on how you're going to compete in a way that you can still communicate to the public and act.
If I have a principal takeaway from what all four of you have shared with us this morning, it's really about the need for a much greater level of understanding about the process by journalists who will cover this, and then real radical transparency. In the past, reporters had the essentially the privilege, the ability to, you cover the horse race, and then you chill out on election day, you cover some of the voting, some color stories, and then you wait for the winner to be declared. This is a election cycle where the weeks between now and election day, it's really incumbent that reporters better understand the process in their jurisdictions, the process, if you're covering the whole country, understand that process, and be able to communicate in a transparent way with their audiences how the process works, how votes are tallied, and why it's taking potentially as long as it is to understand and identify who the winner is.
I think it's all about transparency. The problem isn't that reporters and editors don't know the rules of the road. They do. They're as steeped in this as everyone on this call is. I can tell you that from having been in the newsrooms. They're not used to having to communicate the process.
Yep.
That is where we have to be, news organizations need to be, in your words, radically transparent.
Yeah, Rajiv, if I could give an example from the Kentucky primary, and I realize it's only a primary, but our main election night coverage comes from Kentucky Educational Television, KET. And we knew we weren't going to have very many results on election night. So they actually shortened the show. I was on it. I was one of the guests. And partially why I was picked was because I was both somebody who could interpret the results, as somebody who's still around politics in my state, but also as somebody who used to run the election. So we spent the first half hour talking with the Secretary of State and talking about the mechanics of the election, and also putting in the context why we weren't going to have as many results on election night as we had traditionally. And then we gathered later for another conversation. That's probably too extreme of an example for the November election. But I think that, having those election administrators around to give that context. I also remember, in 2012, Fox was fairly transparent in their election night analysis, because I remember Karl Rove getting in a fight with the decision desk, and he was complaining and saying, "You're looking at these numbers wrong. I think Romney's still got a chance. It's, you're interpreting wrong." And they were very clear, and they'd come on and explain. And in live television, arguing with President Bush, this was 2012, so he was a citizen at that point, but arguing with President Bush's top political guy, one of the top Republican analysts, though, this is why you're wrong. This is what our data shows. It was good television. It was actually riveting, but it was also good just as a citizen to watch them explain and operate in that transparent method that, that Ron's describing.
That's a great example, Trey. Thank you. We're at time, unfortunately, but hopefully several of you can stick around to the end for the open Q&A. Maria, Teresa, Ron, Trey, Norm, thank you all very much. And now let's move to our final panel of the morning on the post-election process, which includes the certification of and administration of the election, the timeline from November 3rd through January 20th, and entry points for challenges and crises. To speak on all of this, we got another group of four fantastic experts. Ned Foley, who's a law professor at Ohio State University. Rachel Kleinfeld, a senior fellow for democracy, conflict, and governance at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Jennifer Morell, a partner at the Elections Group. And Nadav Noti, senior director for trial litigation and chief of staff at the Campaign Legal Center. The roadmap from election day to inauguration day is defined by law. But if we don't know what it looks like, we're none the wiser to disinformation and noise around the process. Knowing what needs to happen by law is critical for voters. The way I'd love to frame this, these four experts are, they each have an area of real specialty. Ned's somebody who I'm keen to hear from about just the overall process and premature claims of victory. Jennifer's an expert on the count itself. Adav is our guy on litigation, and Rachel is somebody who has some really important thoughts and guidance on the possibility of post-election violence. So let me start off, Ned, with you. You're a prolific writer. We know kind of what keeps you up at night, but what I would like to ask you this morning is, how can we be sure that the rules are adhered to and this legal process, which is prescribed by law, actually gets followed from beginning to end?
Yeah, well, thanks, and it's great to be here. I think that's the key point. There are rules in place, and if they're used, we should be confident in the results. What I'm worried about is that the system will actually work well enough to produce a result that corresponds to what the voters actually want, but enough people won't believe in it. And so the system will have worked, but there'll be too much distrust. So how do we avoid that? That's by recognizing that counting votes and, if necessary, reviewing the count is evidence-based, right? The system is designed, it has rules. The votes come in, they need to be verified, particularly the mail votes. Every mail ballot has to be verified before it can be counted. So that means when we do get a final certified official tally that varies state to state, whether it's 2 weeks or 3 weeks or what have you, we can trust that certified result unless there's demonstrable evidence to the contrary. We do need this to be an evidence-based, fact-based analysis. For purposes of the federal system, obviously the whole goal here with respect to the presidential election is to have the state rules for counting the popular votes in the state lead to the electoral college process. And if we don't have a result on election night or even the next day or even the next week, that's not a problem. That's not even a delay, because again, the states will have a certification deadline. Those won't be missed in those first few days. So we shouldn't worry until there's a reason to think that that deadline is in jeopardy. But even that's not a real problem until you get to December 8, because for purposes of the Electoral College, there's some key dates in December, first being December 8, the next being December 14. December 14 is the date that the electors meet. So for purposes of Congress and federal law, we don't have anything that's late or anything that's a delay until we run up against those December deadlines. So if we if each state is capable of coming up with a count that's the answer as to who won the popular vote in that state, and there's no basis to distrust it, that's our answer as to who gets the electoral votes of that state, and that can be definitive for that state in the Electoral College. And if we get to that point, we should have smooth sailing on to January and to Inauguration Day.
Well, Ned, a key takeaway here, again, like with the panel that preceded this one, is that there's homework to be done. And for journalists, for reporters and editors and producers, it's not just understanding some of the mechanics in the run-up to election night and the process of counting and tabulating votes, but it's also understanding what are those milestones from election day onward. And that's, as you so cogently described here, all that's knowable, but we just all have to be better acquainted with it and perhaps not make any non-refundable holiday plans in the month of November. Let me move over to Jennifer, if I could. We talked a little bit about earlier this morning the fact that it could take more than just a night, maybe a few days, maybe a week to count all the votes in certain places. This is your stock and trade. Tell us, how do you see this process playing out, the counting process playing out in the days after the election, particularly in places where we might anticipate both a pretty close general election outcome as well as a high volume of votes by mail?
Yeah, thanks, Rajiv. That's a great question. For starters, I think we all need to remember that we're still running an election in a pandemic, and that has implications across the board about how quickly ballots can be processed. It will slow down and impact most of the election night activities that surround in-person voting and that normal process of closing down the polls, as well as the activities that follow in the days and weeks after the election. One of the best practices for building trust and validation into an election process is to require everything that's done around ballot handling be done in teams of 2. So COVID really impacts that. And then once the polls are closed and those in-person ballots are processed, the attention will turn to processing all of those mail ballots. And for jurisdictions who are allowed to start processing ballots before Election Day, or who are fortunate enough to have recruited extra help, that processing might already be underway, but there will still be a large influx of mail ballots that are dropped off or delivered on Election Day in all jurisdictions. And they will all need to be checked in and given voter credit. They'll need to go through the verification process, whether that is verifying voter information on the return envelope or a voter signature, or ensuring they have a witness to their signature. Whatever the requirements are, no ballot gets opened until it goes through that process. And then we have the opening and extraction process itself, which I know sounds simple and easy, but it often ends up being the biggest bottleneck in the process because it's really tedious. And then finally, ballots get scanned, which might require duplication or adjudication for voter intent. And that's something we always see a higher number of ballots needing that process when they've been hand marked. So we're going to see more need for that. And then in the days that follow the election, while all this processing is taking place, we're going to be waiting. We're waiting for ballots that are allowed to be postmarked on, but returned after Election Day, including those military and overseas ballots that always take a little bit longer. We're going to be waiting for ballots with signature discrepancies or missing signatures that need to be cured in states that provide for that. And then we're going to see a large number of provisional ballots. We heard some earlier commenters talk about that. And these are never counted until all in-person and all the absentee or mail ballots have been counted. So they will actually be the last ballots to be added into the totals. Presidential elections normally result in a higher number of provisional voters anyway. Voters who thought they got registered through an app or a campaign, but the information never actually made it to the election office, or voters who have moved within their jurisdiction and forget to update their address, which is why it's so important for voters to make a plan, as Vanita and Tammy mentioned earlier. But really the main reason we're gonna see a higher number of provisional ballots will be voters who requested an absentee ballot but didn't receive it, or who don't bring it in with them when they decide they would rather vote in person. And processing provisional ballots requires a little research, and so they naturally take more time to process. And throughout all of this, but especially as election officials are preparing to certify their election, there's a ballot accounting and reconciliation that should take place. So verifying the total number of voters who receive credit for voting against the number of ballots cast. And doing that well, making sure that accounting takes place and is accurate also takes time. And this is all assuming that there are no big challenges and things go smoothly, which they won't. There will be issues, some we've planned for and maybe some we haven't. And so what I want to add is that election officials are really stepping up their game. They're thinking more about efficient ways to get this work done. I know they're working crazy long hours. They're trying to recruit additional help. And in the end, it most likely won't be enough, especially when so many of them have their hands tied behind their backs with laws or policies that don't allow them to begin processing absentee ballots earlier than Election Day. So what I think we're going to see, what we're seeing already, are some incredible challenges to the way we administer and conduct our elections. But I would be amiss if I didn't add that we're also going to see these local election administrators, these superheroes, many of whom are dear friends, and we all should be rallying behind them. I think most of them are going to rise to the challenge and surprise all of us with just how well things run, despite the difficulties. So as Norm pointed out, election results have always been unofficial until the election is certified. And I'm optimistic that state and local officials will be able to meet those certification deadlines. And I hope we can keep everyone patient until then and recognize that knowing it's right, having a trustworthy election, it's just going to take time.
Thanks so much, Jennifer, for that. We'll come back to you with some more questions on this subject before we end this morning. I think for me, a key takeaway from what you had to say was it's not just doing the homework and preparing, but it's also the role that journalists have in expectation management and setting. And really, between now and Election Day, helping their audiences, helping the American public more fully understand that the inability for elections officials to declare a clear-cut victor in some places on election night is no fault of the system. It doesn't mean that something is broken. It doesn't mean that the administration of the election is somehow being mismanaged, but this is how it's going to work in this period of time. Adav, let me move over to you, please. Look, litigation is a frequent event following elections. I mean, campaigns, this is the season where they start to lawyer up in every single key jurisdiction. And I think we might expect a level of litigation this year that might put even the high levels of litigation in the past to shame. But as journalists, kind of need to cover this side of this part of the election process. What advice can you provide reporters about how best to discern the good faith litigation from the bad faith ones and navigate what's going to be a very pitched process that's not just going to involve lawyers, but a lot of PR folks trying to spin the litigation. And so this becomes another very thorny, complex element of this election for many of those who are covering it.
Yeah, thanks, Rajiv. It's a great question because I think, unfortunately, the narrative that often takes hold around post-election litigation is that it's just sort of just both sides trying to use the courts to change the results or manipulate the results, and that's not it's not accurate, and it's not a helpful or explanatory narrative. I think there are two sort of hallmarks of post-election litigation that indicate whether it's being conducted in sort of in good faith, in a bona fide attempt to reach the right result for the election. And one is what is the subject matter, what is the goal of the litigation, and the other is the timing of the litigation. So as to the goal, I think the question is this lawsuit intended to help discern the popular will, help discern who got the most votes, or is it intended to obstruct the process in some way of making that determination? So, for example, imagine it's November 4th or November 5th, and a box of ballots turns up somewhere in a counting facility, and it's unquestionably legitimate. There's a chain of custody. No doubt these are legitimate ballots. They just got overlooked in the initial counting. If a campaign sues to stop the counting of those ballots, that, to me, that is not bona fide election litigation. That is not a good faith attempt to find out who won. That's an attempt to say, well, I think those ballots are going to be bad for me, and I don't want them counted. So that's one example of how that might play out in post-election litigation. The other hallmark, I think, is the timing, and specifically the timing of whatever rule or procedure is being challenged. If the lawsuit is a challenge to something that's been on the books for years or decades, and all of a sudden now, a couple days after the election, a candidate or a party is bringing suit to challenge that, it's probably because they think that procedure, which they hadn't previously objected to, is now going to be problematic for them. If the state has a rule that says mailed-in ballots can be counted as long as they're received, 3 days after the election and postmarked by the election, and then 2 days after the election, somebody sues and says, wait, all these mailed ballots are coming in and it's past election day, and those shouldn't count. There would be reason to be skeptical about that. emergency litigation is supposed to be about emergencies. It's supposed to be about something that happened that was unexpected and now needs to be addressed by the courts, and that is perfectly legitimate, and courts can sort that out. But if it's gamesmanship, the courts are skeptical about it, and journalists should be too.
Adav, thank you very much. I'd like to bring Rachel into the conversation and talk about the potential for conflict. And share with us your thoughts, because this is a subject you've thought and studied a lot about. What do you believe that the chances are for violence and conflict, both in the run-up to the actual day of the election, but significantly during what may be an uncertain and chaotic process following it? And specifically, what advice would you have for journalists who would be in a position of covering any sort of civil unrest connected to the election?
Well, thrilled to be here. Thanks for the question. I know we're supposed to smile when we're on these kinds of pressers. It's always hard for me given my topic area. We are at a dangerous moment. And it's not just because of the election, it's because of the confluence of the pandemic and the election. Diseases throughout history have triggered xenophobia and fear. It makes people want to stick to their group, however they define that emotionally. There's even studies on pregnant women that they become more focused on their in-group at that point. We're also all pent up at home. We're angry about everything, not just politics. And then an election primes those layers of division along partisan lines and tells you how to channel that anger. So you already have large percentages on both sides saying that if the election doesn't go the way they believe it should go, they won't accept the results. So I am concerned about violence, largely after the election. What you learn from other countries with strong democratic institutions is that you don't see pre-election partisan violence very much. And on election day, you may see intimidation, but not outright violence. But afterward, if people feel that the election isn't going their way, it could be a problem. But I think what's really important to remember is that it's not at all inevitable. There's a lot we can do to prevent it or to keep it quite rare. So let me focus on the three groups that need to act in that world: voters, the press, and state and local leaders particularly. So first, voters. They need to recognize that we're in the midst of a pandemic. We're going to be voting absentee on an unprecedented scale. There will not be results on election night, no matter what any politician says. All the things the prior speakers have made, all these points. And because more Republicans are saying that they plan to vote on election day because of less worry about the pandemic, and because many Democrats are saying they'll vote absentee or early, we're expecting that early returns might lean red and then move more blue. That's no reason to expect anything going wrong, and voters need to be shown that we should expect that. You need to be really skeptical about allegations or appearances of fraud and just take a deep breath, not expect your side will win. Now on the press, your specific point, the press has a huge role here in explaining these points to voters, but also in following the significant research on best practices to reduce violence and the ways that communication itself inflames anger and polarization. There's actually quite a lot of research into this area, and it's not always followed and should be. So first, the need to offer a more complex story, that this is not just red versus blue. First of all, there's violent fringes on both sides, and there are mainstream politicians and leaders on both sides condemning those violent groups. And so it's really important to cover the divisions within, and particularly to highlight leaders that are condemning violence on their side. Their side is important. Communication in which a leader condemns their own side for violence is far more effective than condemning the other side for obvious reasons. Second of all, don't sensationalize violence. I had an op-ed in the Washington Post last weekend. I had an extremely long and drawn out discussion about the title. For all of those who write op-eds, you rarely get to comment on the title, but the title was sensationalistic and it went against the best practices of communication. And I talked with them a lot about what do we do to de-escalate, because so many people only read the titles. I won on the subtitle, but not on the title. Really important for the press not to paint political solutions as entirely ineffective or out of the question, this just won't happen. When people who are angry feel that they are blocked to achieve something in a normal political process, that's when violence occurs. And so having the press reiterate that there are normal channels for resolving disputes, that we have a court system, that we have litigation, and that's actually the way things should happen in our country, is a much better role than saying this is such a partisan state or what have you, that those channels are blocked. And then finally, how the government responds plays a really significant role in how violence and whether violence escalates. Secretary Chertoff said early this morning, there are laws that restrict what the federal government can do on election day. And really, there's no proper role for DHS or the military before, during, or after the election. These issues, if they happen, will be handled by state and local law enforcement, should be handled by state and local law enforcement. That's in part because of the laws, but it's also in part because we're at a very low point in social trust, and trust is highest for state and local leaders. So to wrap up for them, state and local leaders can train and prepare their law enforcement in best practices for managing protests peacefully, de-escalating, separating protesters and counter-protesters. They can speak together in a bipartisan fashion wherever possible, saying votes are still being counted, not declaring early victory. And finally, they need to condemn violence on both sides, and they need to prosecute violence swiftly, catch the violent individuals and prosecute them. That detracts others from being violent. And I'll just end with, people want to focus on violence, but the reason that we're worried about violence is because we have this ailing body politic. And ultimately, that's where the press needs to focus, on the solution set that will move us past that, because that's what Americans want to see. More in Common polls show 96% of Americans think we should be Americans first and partisans second. And they really want to see more focus on moving past those partisan divides.
Rachel, thank you so much for that clear and maybe a little sobering discussion. I'd like to now continue the conversation, but bring in some of our earlier panelists for the next 25 minutes or so, and just welcome back Norm Ornstein, Ron Fournier, Trey Grayson, Brendan Nyhan, and I don't know if Tammy Patrick's still with us. Oh, fantastic, Tammy's here too. Let me move to a couple of audience questions and throw this out. I'm going to throw this out for the group. This one comes from Miles Parks at NPR. And he writes that he's heard from voters, specifically Democratic voters, who are considering how to vote, specifically based on worries about when their votes will be counted, i.e. choosing to vote in person instead of by mail, so their votes will be reflected in early returns. He is keen to hear thoughts on this and what guidance journalists might provide to the electorate writ large, whether people should be using this as part of their decision-making process, or should be really only considering their health and safety and convenience when choosing how they're going to vote.
So yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Tammy.
I'm looking at Jen to see if she wants to jump in first. Very quickly, I will just say that is the reason why I am voting by mail. Because in many jurisdictions, the vote by mail ballots, the ballots that are voted early in person, are the first ones counted. So when the holograms hit on election night, right when the polls close, in many, many places, those are in fact the early ballots that have been returned, but only if they're returned early enough to get processed and counted before those results hit the airwaves. So that's why I am voting by mail, as a matter of fact.
And in some states, there's also a third option, right, which is early voting. A state like Pennsylvania, which might not start counting mailed-in ballots until election day, there is an option for people to vote early. Jennifer, let me bring you into this question as well.
Yeah, I would have just echoed exactly what Tammy said. In many states, those will be the first ballots added. You're right, Pennsylvania is offering early absentee voting. And I think the more important message, though, is focusing on completing that absentee ballot accurately. I understand the concern, and every state has slightly different requirements for how the security envelope is sealed and what is signed and what information is provided. So I would say if you're returning early and then making sure you understand the requirements for successfully completing that return ballot envelope are key to getting your ballot counted and counted early.
And let me add a little bit to what Jennifer said. Most states allow voters to cure their absentee ballot if there's a problem. And so if you submit it earlier and it gets processed earlier and they find a problem earlier, then you have more time to fix it. Although, even with all that, we do know there are more there are absentee ballots that are rejected because somebody fills out even the most careful person might forget a signature or something like that. And so, some people, if they really want to make sure their votes count, that's the, voting in person. And by trying to do the early option, it gives you more days if something comes up on the day you're planning to vote. You don't have to hold off until that last day. But I think it is important to recognize that that is one of the reasons why we want to make sure they're in-person voting options, is that there is a risk that you don't complete the paperwork correctly. And when you have a poll worker helping you in an in-person voting experience, whether election day or early, that gets worked out. But there are ballots get lost on election day too. I mean, there's no system that's 100% foolproof. I mean, we want to get it to 100%, but let's just face it, it's not. But I think if the specific question is, how do I make sure my results are in early? Yeah, that absentee voting early, like Tammy said, or in-person early is the way to make sure that you're in that first count.
One caveat to all of that is that there are many states that don't allow the processing of votes by mail until election day, which means in effect till the day after. And those may take some time. So I agree with Tammy and Jennifer and Trey. If you are voting in a state that enables the early processing, then definitely vote by mail early. If you feel comfortable with the health risks of voting early in person in states that don't allow the ballots to be counted early, then certainly think about that.
Thank you all. I think, again, underscoring the fact that there is no one-size-fits-all solution here, and elections vary, the rules vary by state, and in some cases even within parts of states. So for those covering this, if you're assigned a certain geography, understand the rules in that geography. We'll turn to another question from our attendees, and this one comes from Allison Stevens at States Newsroom. And I'm gonna direct this to the former journalist on the panel here, to Ron first. How confident are you and other panelists that the media is up to the challenges that all of you have laid out today?
Well, on one level, I'm confident that there's a system in place now where the news leaders, the bureau chiefs, the lead political reporters, the heads and the members of decision desks, they know their stuff. I know at the Associated Press, they've been studying everything that we've been talking about in this panel now for months, and huge teams of folks who are digging into these issues as much as this panel is. I think if they use that structure, as I mentioned earlier, that consortium, to work together to make sure that they're not letting their competitive pressures move too quick to make bad calls. And they're using their joint voice to be more transparent about how the vote is counted in this country, both on election night and the many weeks afterwards election night. I think they could move big steps forwards towards being a more responsible part of the system. My real concern isn't as much that as what impact does the media have anymore? Who listens to objective media anymore? Who is swayed by objective media anymore? I think this is a we the people problem and not just an institutional problem. It's bigger than the parties. It's bigger than the media. It's bigger than a lot of the institutional systems we have in this country. Does the American electorate want to hear the truth on election night? Or is there going to be half the country that's going to hear that their person won and the other side lost, and the other country is going to hear the exact opposite? We know that's how the public is moving now, that we're walking around in our intellectual bubbles and aren't listening to the truth. We're listening to our team's truth. That's my biggest concern.
Let me just add that, objective media, I would issue the following warning. This is not just about changing the way you cover the election to take into account that this is going to be a very different election. This is basically broadcasting the truth, which is not a he said kind of thing anymore. And it gets back to what Hari Srinivasan's question was earlier. If you simply report what Donald Trump said, or any other politician or figure out there without indicating whether it's false or true, if you try and make it something like Trump says election is a fraud, Biden disagrees, you are not doing your job anymore. The whole mindset of journalism has to change now because we're in a very different world and the threat is a different one.
Can I,
if I can jump in here, one last point I'd like to add is the importance of state and local news outlets. I think the national outlets that have specialized teams and expertise are getting better prepared for this challenge. I think as you move down the ladder, though, given the pressures on local news, the lack of resources, more limited expertise, and I would say not just print, but especially local TV, people get a lot of their news from those sources. They trust local news more. It's going to be especially important for the expertise that's represented here to reach those people, for the guidance from the Associated Press to reach their partners at the local level. If we think of this as just a national problem, we're going to miss so much of where Americans get their news. Most people don't read the New York Times and the Washington Post.
That's a great
right?
point,
That's
Brent.
only a small part of our news ecosystem.
Yeah.
and this is
all
Ned, if I
very,
could,
very yes,
just-
Ned.
yeah, I think the media is doing a very good job this year in understanding the effect of the pandemic and the voting process, and emphasizing that what the media does is projections. So I want to applaud the media for tackling the moment. I still think there's more work to be done, and it's particularly on this concept of delay. Even though the networks and the media are saying, we need to tell you new information about the voting process and don't expect answers on election night, they're still buying into this narrative that it's a delay. And that is an idea that something is wrong if things are delayed. And I think it's very important to understand that from a legal perspective, there is no delay at all. The only delay is in the capacity to project. So that is a media issue. And I understand why, and the media does a service with the projections, but I think if the media is going to be doing the full transparency and explanation, it has to understand the dynamic relationship of what it does and what the officials do. So we're getting close to where we need to be. We're getting partway there, but we're not all the way there yet, in my judgment.
Thank you all. I mean, key takeaway here is that, of course, reporters are obsessed with the horse race, but this is an election cycle where the explanatory side is critical. And transparency, understanding the process, and bringing the public along. I'd like to turn to a question that comes from Anthony Cave about social media platforms. And maybe I'll start with you with this, Brendan, and then others chime in very quickly here. What advice would you have for journalists in terms of responding when social media platforms move too slowly or fail to remove fictitious or outright false content connected to the election from their platforms?
I think it's become an important form of accountability journalism for reporters to identify harmful content on social media. That's often the only way to get them to keep up with the most dangerous or novel threats, especially to the legitimacy of the election. So I welcome that kind of coverage. The balance to be struck there, though, is to bring accountability to the platforms in failing to uphold their responsibility, while at the same time not amplifying content that's getting very little exposure or engagement. We've talked about this problem of amplification before, but I just want to underscore how much coverage is now being done of posts on Facebook that hundreds or low thousands of people saw, which in the scope of Facebook is nothing, right? That is a rounding error on a rounding error. It is not a meaningful thing to bring to hundreds of thousands or millions of people via your media platform. And so we need to be really careful in making those news judgments. It might even be the case that the reporting should be centered on the problem with the platform, not the content of the misinformation itself. And so I think there's going to be a real balance to strike here. It will be easy to cover the freak show online, and in doing so, center your coverage on misinformation in a way that could potentially be harmful.
let me turn quickly to the subject of information resources. Again, not directed to anybody in particular, but if, some of you feel free to both answer right now or augment in the chat. But I think it would be really helpful for those who are listening in to hear what you guys think are some of the best resources out there for journalists seeking to become better schooled in terms of the legal process, the actual mechanics of vote counting, and other critical elements connected to this election that we've identified as just critical in terms of more transparently communicating with the public.
Our task force.
Start. Yeah, the task force is good. But I would start when you have to ask, what is your lens? Is your lens state and local? Is your lens national? If your lens is state and local, then I would start with the state Secretary of State, State Board of Elections, whatever the entity is at the top. That website, that office, and those individuals is probably the best place. Some of the larger local jurisdictions may have good information. It also may be outdated or frankly even wrong. So I would start with the state. The Secretary of State's Association and the State Elections Directors Associations have created something called Trusted Info. It's a hashtag, and they've allowed partners to come into that in addition to some of the government agencies. So that Trusted Info. If you're looking for a national perspective, I'll get some of the task force. I'll put a plug in for. I thought the Washington Post has a great, well-designed, informative website. I can't tell you everything in there is correct because it's an all 50 state site, but it looks really informative. But more importantly, it's easy to navigate. So if you're looking for a one-stop shop for that, I actually found that site pretty good. So I don't know if we have anybody from the Post here, but kudos to them.
I would just say to all of the journalists here, we will give you a link to people to contact at for our task force, because we have a wide range of experts on all the fields and areas here. And if you have a specific question, you can contact the task force, contact through Protect Democracy, and they will direct you to the person or people who will be best able to answer those questions.
Thank you, Norm. Excellent point. Let me, I just want to add one other thing to what Norm was saying. Everybody who's in attendance today will be getting from the task force a package from us with a lot of this information and a set of resources. First step, we'll proactively reach out to you, and to amplify Norm's point, everybody should any journalist should feel free to reach out to the task force and the staff of Protect Democracy with questions, and we will certainly point to the right resources, as well as our co-sponsor today, Elections SOS, which is at electionssos.org. A question again from Roan Phillip with regard to disinfo robocalls. Does anybody on the panel have any suggestions for how to track the money and groups behind disinformation robocalls? I see a lot of head shaking there. Perennial challenge, both for election watchdogs and journalists.
I'll just say I used to run a 501c3 and a 501c4. We occasionally used non-disinformation accurate robocalls. You know, there are many, many contractors. It's not a lot of money. It's very, very hard to trace where these things are coming from. And I'm not sure it's the best use of journalism, just to put a cap on it. The reason misinformation spreads in our society is because, as Ron was saying, we have problems in our society with people willing to believe it. And I think focusing less on who did what, because we know there are many, many nefarious actors who want to do things that will spread misinformation, and more on why are we being susceptible to this, and how can we strengthen our own ability to screen for misinformation? How can we be more careful about where our media is coming from? How can we double check sources and so on, is a more useful role for the media than the amount of resources it would take to look into a $20,000 payment for robocalls in a certain precinct, which is going to be nearly impossible.
And Rajiv, if I can just add to what Rachel just said, that's why I think it's so important that we are all encouraging voters to go to their local site, because sometimes those calls or those letters can come from well-meaning groups, not necessarily groups that are trying to have nefarious actions, but well-meaning groups that just simply get the dates or the information wrong. And it immediately creates distrust among voters. So just that constant sort of hammering home, go to your local source, go to your trusted source, trusted info, I think is critical.
Our big societal challenge isn't just how do we teach people what's true and false. It's how do we teach the American public to want to know what's true and what's false.
And for media organizations, if you encourage people, if they get a robocall that's giving them false information about an election, when you can vote, where you can vote, or the like, and they can record it or give it to you, and you can then broadcast or write, this is wrong. If you get this call, go to your local election site. It might help more than trying to find out who funded it in the first place.
Let me just double down on Norm's point there. I live in New Mexico. Here we have a very well-meaning nonprofit, as Jennifer was saying, that's been sending out multiple pieces of mail to everyone telling us to get our absentee ballots. And if people have already registered for their absentee ballots and they follow the well-meaning guide here, they get back something saying that they can't get another absentee ballot, but the wording of it makes those voters afraid that neither absentee ballot is counting, and it's causing a lot of confusion. And the local newspaper, which is locally owned and an extremely good newspaper, printed a front page story on this problem so that people can understand what's going on and ignore these mailers if they've already sent things in. So as Norm's saying, rather than tracking down the source, making people aware of the problem can be a better use of resources.
And I'd also add letting the Secretary of State's and State Election Director's offices know, because then they can disseminate it as well. It also helps that it could be something that's going on all across the country, and so they can plug that information back into their networks. And if it happened to be foreign, there CISA is monitoring the elections as well, and so getting it to those government sources can be helpful. I had a friend who sent me something, and we passed it along the other day. His daughter got a text message saying, "Hey, you can get an absentee ballot in Michigan," and she's never lived there. It's probably just an error. It probably wasn't nefarious, but you never know.
So we've got just a couple of minutes left. I would like to do a quick lightning round with everybody on the panel with a sort of practical takeaway for our journalists in the audience. And that is, based on everything that was shared today, what is the one, in each of your opinions, the one most important thing that journalists should do to prepare right now in covering this election? And I'll just go by the order in which I see you guys on my Zoom screen. So I'm going to, apologies, Ned, I'm going to put you on the hot seat first. Just a quick response. What's the single most important thing you think journalists can and should start doing now with regard to the coverage of this election?
Great. Well, in addition to not using the word delay, as I said before, I would focus on questions about anything that comes your way. Does it affect the integrity of the result and the ability of the system to actually work? Because as I think Trey said, others said, there are going to be problems. There's no perfect election, but is what you're writing about or talking about, does it undermine the capacity of the system to do its job, which is to produce a winner that is the genuine choice of the voters as a whole? And so always ask that question. Is what I'm talking about systemic or individual? I don't want any voter to have a problem or to be disenfranchised. Again, we want 100%, but we're not going to get it. But a problem that sadly affects one voter, as bad as that is, doesn't undermine the entirety of the election. As I wrote about recently, an election with some flaws is not a failed election. And so don't buy a narrative that we have complete failure if in fact the system can actually work as a whole.
Thanks, Ned. I got a minute left, so 10 seconds apiece. Jennifer.
Yeah, focus on the things that are being done to know the election is right. Focus on the physical control mechanisms, the procedural validations, and it's an amazing opportunity to give the American public a civics lesson this year.
Thank you, Adav.
I'd say know what the rules and procedures are so you can spot when there are deviations versus things that are happening as planned, even if delayed.
Awesome. Rachel.
Complexify your story. It's not just red versus blue. There's nuances within both those groups. And particularly when it comes to violence, make sure those folks are extremes and fringes. Don't normalize it as a red or blue problem.
Thank you. Trey.
Reach out to your election administrators right now and ask them two questions. How can I help you? And two, how can you help me cover this race better?
Fantastic. Tammy.
Emphasize early action. Don't wait to register. Don't wait to check your registration. Don't wait to request. Don't wait to return. Don't wait until November 3rd. Vote early.
Thank you. Norm.
This is an unprecedented time, to use the word you've used so often, and journalists have to change their mindset. This is not business as usual, either in the election itself or the way in which you cover elections or politics.
Great. Brendan.
Make a coverage plan now before things get crazy so that your newsroom has made considered judgments about how to handle your responsibility to cover this election appropriately.
And last but not least, Ron.
Don't bow to pressure. Don't bow to critics. Prepare yourself, your family, and most importantly, your readers and viewers for the fact that you probably won't know who the president is until December or January.
Such great collective advice. Thank you to all of you for taking time out of your schedules to join us today to share your insights on these issues. And importantly, to our audience, thank you for taking the time to join us. I know how hectic life is as a journalist, and that you've carved out 2 hours to do this really speaks to what you think about our democracy, the role of the press, and the importance of getting it right. So big thank you to you. A summary of resources and the issues covered today will be shared with you following this event, as I mentioned earlier. As you prepare for coverage over the next several months of this unprecedented election, the task force, Election SOS, and the experts you've heard from today are all available to you as an ongoing resource. Please refer to our website, electiontaskforce.org. Again, electiontaskforce.org. As stakeholders in our democracy, we all have our work cut out for us, but the task force is ready to help to support your quality journalism. We know you want to get it right. We know you want to be fair, and we're here to help. Let us know how we can be helpful. Don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're here to answer your questions, to serve voters and our democracy. Preserving a free and fair election is a patriotic duty, not a partisan one. Thank you again for joining us. Be safe and have a good day.